On Thursday, August the 4th, 1892, in the quiet textile mill town of Fall River in Massachusetts, which is around 50 miles south of Boston, two brutal murders were committed at the family home at 92 2nd Street by Lizzie Borden, except she didn't. Or did she? The compelling evidence, her family, friends and neighbours were against her. At the trial, the jury made their considered decision, and the Lizzie Borden murder case became one of the most famous in American criminal history as New England's major crime of the Gilded Age, with all of its barbarity captivating the national press, and was immortalised by a chilling rhyme. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. Lizzie Borden was born on July the 19th, 1860, in Fall River, to Sarah and Andrew Borden, and ahead of her were sisters Emma and Alice, who had died at 22 months old. Andrew Borden was of English and Welsh descent, growing up in modest surroundings, struggling financially as a young man, despite being the descendant of a wealthy and influential family. He eventually prospered in the making and selling of furniture, and then became a successful property developer. He was director of several textile mills and owned considerable commercial property. At the time of his death, his estate was valued at $300,000. Despite being well off, Borden was known for his frugality, and the family home lacked indoor plumbing, even though it was a common feature for the wealthy at that time. The house was located in an affluent area, but the wealthiest residents of Fall River generally lived in the more fashionable neighborhood called the Hill, which was further from the industrial areas of the city. Lizzie and her sister Emma had a relatively religious upbringing and were very involved in church activities, as well as contemporary social movements, such as the Woman's Christian Temperance Union. She was also a member of the Ladies' Fruit and Flower Mission. Andrew Borden married Abby Gray 3 years after the death of the children's mother, when Lizzie was 4 and Emma was 14. Lizzie later said she called her stepmother Mrs. Borden and demurred on whether they had a cordial relationship. She believed that Abby had married her father for his money. Bridget Sullivan was the Borden's 25-year-old live-in maid who had emigrated from Ireland, and noted that Lizzie and Emma rarely ate meals with their parents. In May 1892, Andrew Borden killed a number of pigeons in his barn with a hatchet, believing that they carried infections and diseases. Lizzie had recently built a roost for the pigeons and was upset at their demise. A family argument in July prompted both sisters to take extended holidays in New Bedford. They returned to Fall River a week before the terrible events were to take place. Tension had been growing within the family in the months before the murders, especially over Andrew's gifts of some buildings to various branches of Abby's family. Their stepmother's sister received a house. John Morse, Lizzie and Emma's maternal uncle, visited the Borden home the night before the killings, and Andrew invited him to stay for a few days to discuss business matters. This has led to speculation that their conversation may have aggravated an already tense situation, particularly about property transfer. The entire household had also been ill for several days before the murders, which didn't help the situation. It was later speculated that it was caused by mutton that had been left on the stove to use for meals over several days. Abby had feared poison, given that Andrew had not been a popular man in Fall River. Morse had arrived in the evening of Wednesday, August the 3rd, and slept in the guest room that night. Everyone came to breakfast the next morning, after which Borden and Morse went to the sitting room, where they chatted for around an hour. Morse left around 9 a.m. to buy a couple of cows and visit his niece, planning to return for lunch. Borden, meanwhile, left for his morning walk. One of the children's regular chores was to clean the guest room, but that morning stepmother Abby went upstairs sometime between 9 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. to make the bed. According to the police, Abby was facing her killer at the time of the attack. She was first struck on the side of the head with a hatchet, which cut her just above the ear, causing her to turn and fall face down on the floor, creating contusions on her nose and forehead. Her killer then struck her multiple times, delivering 70 more hits to the back of her head and killing her. Andrew Borden returned at around 10:30 a.m. His key failed to open the door, so he knocked. Sullivan, the maid, went to unlock the door, but found it jammed, later telling the police that she heard Lizzie laughing immediately after this, but could not see her, but stated that the laughter seemed to come from the top of the stairs. This was thought significant, as Abby was already dead by this time, and her body would have been visible to anyone looking through the open door to the bedroom. Lizzie later denied being upstairs and told the authorities that her father had asked her where Abby was, to which she replied that a messenger had delivered a message asking Abby to come and visit a sick friend. The maid told the police that she helped to remove 69-year-old Borden's boots and gave him his slippers before he settled on the sofa for a nap in the living room. This detail was contradicted by the crime scene photos, which showed Borden still wearing his boots. Her statement continued that she was in her top-floor room, resting from cleaning windows just before 11:10 a.m., when she heard Lizzie calling from downstairs. "Maggie, come quick, father's dead. Somebody came in and killed him." Borden was slumped on the sofa, hit 10 or 11 times with a hatchet-like weapon. One of his eyes had been split cleanly in two, suggesting that he had been asleep when attacked, estimated to have been around 11 a.m. Family doctor Dr. Bowen arrived and pronounced both victims dead. In the early hours of August the 4th, after the discovery of the bodies, the public knew that the killer had attacked the victims in broad daylight in their home, and there was no apparent reason why. Neighbours and passers-by heard nothing. No one saw a suspect enter or leave. Lizzie was initially not thought of as a suspect, but her behaviour in the aftermath of the tragic events, as well as snippets of circumstantial evidence, led to suspicions pointing in her direction. She initially claimed she had been in the adjacent barn eating pears when the attacks happened, but later changed her story. She had also attempted to buy deadly prussic acid, better known as cyanide, in a diluted form at the local pharmacy, claiming it was to be used to clean her fur coat, even though the substance had no antiseptic or cleaning properties, which was probably why her request was declined, and she left empty-handed. She was also seen after the murders burning a dress, saying that it had paint stains on it. It was never determined whether it was the dress that she had been wearing on the day of the murders. There had been tensions in the Borden household between Lizzie, her sister Emma, their father, and stepmother Abby. The family reportedly had their meals separately, and Lizzie would not acknowledge Abby as a mother, always referring to her as stepmother. Her father's frugal nature was well known, and some believed that Lizzie killed him, so she and her sister would receive their inheritance. Another theory is that Lizzie was unhappy, as she was still under her father's influence while living in the family home at the age of 32, and still unmarried, with no prospects in sight. 69-year-old Andrew Borden was one of the richest businessmen in Fall River, with his 64-year-old second wife, Abby. Since no will stating otherwise was ever found, should Andrew predecease his wife, Abby was set to inherit his fortune, while the two daughters would inherit nothing. Lizzie's initial answers to the different police officers' questions were strange and contradictory. The officers who interviewed her reported that they disliked her attitude, saying that she was too calm and poised, and her inability to summon a single tear aroused their suspicions. Initially, she said that she heard a groan or a distress call before coming back into the house from the barn. 2 hours later, she told police that she heard nothing, not realizing that anything was wrong. When asked where her stepmother was, she recounted Abby's receiving a note asking her to visit a sick friend. She also said that she thought that Abby had returned and asked if someone would go upstairs and look for her. Bridget Sullivan, the maid, went upstairs, and when she looked into the bedroom, she saw the stepmother lying face down on the floor in a pool of blood. Despite her behaviour and changing alibis, she was not checked for bloodstains. Police did search her room, but it was a cursory inspection only, and at the trial, they admitted to not doing a proper search because Lizzie was not feeling well, and the police were subsequently criticised for their lack of diligence. In the cellar, investigators found 2 hatchets, 2 axes, and a hatchet head with a broken handle. The hatchet head was suspected of being the murder weapon, as the break in the handle appeared fresh, and the ash and dust on its head appeared to have been deliberately applied to make it look as if it had been in the basement for some time. However, none of these tools were removed from the house. The day after the murders on August the 5th, John Morse, the uncle, left the Borden residence and was mobbed by hundreds of people, and the police had to escort him back to the house for his own safety. The following day, police did a more thorough search of the house, inspecting the sisters' clothing and confiscating the broken-handled hatchet head. That evening, a police officer and the mayor visited the house, and Lizzie was informed that she was a suspect in the case. While the public largely believed that she committed the deadly deeds, the police initially considered the killings the work of a man, possibly a foreigner. Within a few hours, they arrested a suspect, an innocent Portuguese immigrant from the town's new diaspora of European workers. There was also an influx of Irish men and women as Fall River's immigrant population surged, and more of them turned to policing. On the day of the murders, Irish police were among the dozen or so who took control of the victim's house and property and interviewed Lizzie. The inquest took place on the 5th of August, and Lizzie took the stand on each of its 3 days. It was the only time she testified under oath. The court refused her request to have her family lawyer present, citing a state statute which said that an inquest must be held in private. She had been prescribed regular doses of morphine to calm her nerves, and it was possible that her testimony was affected by this. Her behaviour was erratic, and she often refused to answer a question, even if the answer would be beneficial to her, as well as frequently contradicting herself, providing alternating accounts of the morning in question, such as saying that she was in the kitchen reading a magazine when her father arrived home, then saying she was in the dining room doing some ironing, and then saying she was coming down the stairs, or in the barn. It was revealed that Abby had died around an hour and a half before her husband, and that no conclusive murder weapon was found. 3 days later, Lizzie was arrested and remanded in prison, where she stayed for the next 9 months. The inquest testimony, the basis for regarding her guilt or innocence, was later ruled inadmissible at her trial. A grand jury began hearing evidence on November the 7th, and she was formally charged with murder on December the 2nd. The trial took place in New Bedford, starting on June the 5th, 1893. There was a significant interest from the public and the media alike. People from around the country were following the case, and it had plenty of dramatic moments. Something worth noting was that another axe murder had occurred in Fall River 5 days before the hearing. This time, the victim was Bertha Manchester, who was found hacked to death in her kitchen. The similarities between the two murders were striking and was noted by the jurors. A Portuguese immigrant by the name of José Correa de Mello was convicted of this murder in 1894, but he was thought not to have been in the vicinity of Fall River at the time of the Borden murders. A prominent point of discussion during the trial was the hatchet head found in the basement, which was not convincingly demonstrated by the prosecution to be the murder weapon. Prosecutors argued that the killer had removed the handle because it had been covered in blood. One officer testified that a hatchet handle was found nearby, but another officer contradicted this. No blood-stained clothing was found at the scene, but Bridget Sullivan, the maid, testified that she had witnessed Lizzie burn her dress, saying that it had been ruined when she brushed against wet paint. During the course of the trial, the defense never attempted to challenge this statement. Her lawyers stressed that the prosecution offered no murder weapon and possessed no blood-stained clothing. As to the prussic acid, Borden was a victim of misidentification, they claimed. In addition, throughout the saga, her legion of supporters remained steadfast that Borden's guilt was inconceivable, as a well-brought-up virtuous woman could never commit such a crime. Lizzie's presence at the house was also a point of dispute. The account goes that 26-year-old Bridget Sullivan, the maid, went to her room on the top floor at around 10:58 a.m. and left Lizzie and her father downstairs. Lizzie told several people that she went into the barn and was not in the house for half an hour or so. This was corroborated by 2 witnesses. At 11:10, Lizzie discovered her father's body and yelled for Sullivan to come downstairs and told her that her father had been murdered and told her not to enter the room, but instead to go and get the family doctor from across the street. But he was out on a call. Lizzie then told Sullivan to get a friend from down the road. These statements had helped keep Lizzie off the suspects list at first. She was, after all, a Sunday school teacher at her local church. The family doctor, who staunchly believed in the accused's innocence, testified that after the murders, he prescribed a double dose of morphine to help her sleep. Its side effects, he claimed, could account for her confusion. Emma, who also lived at home, claimed that the sisters harbored no anger towards their stepmother, yet the police investigation and the family and neighbours who gave interviews to newspapers suggested otherwise. On the day in question, with Emma 15 miles away on holiday, Lizzie and Sullivan were the only ones at home with the stepmother after her father had left for his morning walk. Sullivan was outside washing windows when Abby was killed. Lizzie's father was bludgeoned in the sitting room shortly after his return, while the maid was resting in her top-floor room. Unable to account consistently for Lizzie's movements, the judge, district attorney, and police concluded she was probably guilty. The jury was sent to deliberate, and after an hour and a half, they acquitted Lizzie of the murders due to the circumstantial evidence, and she was released, but still remained the prime suspect. Over the years, various theories have been put forward as to who was the real killer, and there are a number of names in the frame. Let's start with another significant suspect, John Morse, Lizzie's maternal uncle, who rarely met with the family after his sister died, but had stayed at the house the night before the murders. According to the police, he provided an absurdly perfect and over-detailed alibi. He was considered a suspect, but was later discounted. He had arrived unexpectedly from Iowa and without any luggage. A butcher by trade, Morse and Borden often did business together, specifically dealing with livestock. Morse was said to be close to his nieces and loyal to his deceased sister. At Lizzie's 3-day inquest, he testified he'd had breakfast with Andrew and Abby before leaving for the post office at 8:45 a.m. He visited with other Borden relatives who corroborated his story, then took the trolley home. To some, his alibi is suspiciously detailed, as he noted the trolley number, the number on the driver's hat, and 6 priests who are also en route. On returning to the scene of the crime, for example, he didn't notice the crowd gathering out front and casually walked around to the back of the house to pick up pear. Someone else who was around the house on the day of the double murder was Irish immigrant Bridget Sullivan, the maid. At the time of the slayings, about 9:30 a.m. for Abby and 11 a.m. for Andrew, as per the autopsies performed on the Borden's dining room table. Just one other person was there, washing windows at the time, an alibi Lizzie corroborated. Sullivan in turn testified faithfully on Lizzie's behalf, telling authorities that all was well and good in the Borden home, a statement that was clearly false. If she was actually not involved with the crime, why would she lie? Perhaps it was because she was a maid and she wanted to continue to get work. Unless she was secretly paid off, Sullivan had no motive. In an improbable scenario such as this, although she probably would not have wielded the hatchet, she could have been an accomplice after Lizzie hastily killed her stepmother, leaving the duo no choice but to kill Andrew when he returned to the house. She died in 1948, and it was claimed that she gave a deathbed confession to her sister that she had changed her testimony on the stand to protect Lizzie. Although Emma Borden, the older sister by 9 years, had an alibi as she was on holiday at Fairhaven with friends, about 15 miles or 2 hours from Fall River, it is possible that she might have secretly visited the family home to kill her parents before returning to Fairhaven in time to receive a telegram informing her of the murders. If 32-year-old Lizzie's motive for murder was rage and resentment at her limited place in life, then wouldn't 41-year-old Emma have been more desperate and even angrier? Their overprotective father had suppressed and repressed his daughters and did not allow either to date, both being considered spinsters without marital prospects. In 1892, Fall River had a prominent population of Portuguese and Irish immigrants, whom the town's more established residents considered second-class citizens. In turn, the immigrants formed their own hierarchy, with the Portuguese occupying the lowest rung. Many worked in the industrial town's textile mills, of which Andrew Borden owned several. A self-made man, he had a reputation for being shrewd, who had little sympathy or generosity for his workers and tenants. So when Irish policemen first arrived at the scene, they automatically assumed, wrongly, that the crime was a robbery gone wrong, committed by a Portuguese immigrant, who was likely drunk and still on the loose. Within a few hours, 3 Portuguese men were arrested on suspicion of murder, including Antonio Oriel, who was apprehended at 2:15 p.m. while he was drinking in a local bar. Since he, like all the others, had a firm alibi and no known connection to Andrew Borden, He was soon released. The crime could have been pinned on various immigrants, but in the end it wasn't. Let's not forget another potential suspect, Jose Correa de Mello, the other axe murderer. What if the killer was indeed a deranged psychopath? In the small town of Fall River, on May the 30th, 9 months after the Borden murders, and just 5 days before Lizzie's trial, Bertha Manchester was found brutally killed. The day that Lizzie's trial began, news broke that the Portuguese immigrant worker had been arrested. He was a disgruntled employee, and could it be that his plans to rob his employer's house snowballed into murder? It has been suggested that the 19-year-old wasn't even in America when the Bordens were killed. Although he maintained his innocence, he served 20 years for his crime. Following Lizzie's acquittal, the sisters sold the house they'd hated and moved to an upmarket neighborhood called The Hill. They named their 7-bedroom Victorian mansion Maplecroft. Lizzie began using the name Lisbeth A. Borden. At their new house, they had a staff that included live-in maids, a housekeeper, and a coachman. Because stepmother Abby was ruled to have died before her husband Andrew, her estate went first to her husband, and then, on his death, passed to his daughters. A considerable settlement was paid to settle claims by Abby's family. Despite the acquittal, Lizzie was shunned and ostracized by Fall River society. Her name was again brought into the public eye when she was accused of shoplifting in Providence, Rhode Island, in 1897. In 1905, shortly after an argument between the two sisters, they had a bad falling out, and Emma moved out of the house and never saw or spoke to her sister again. Lizzie was ill during the last year of her life. Aged 66, she died of pneumonia on June 1st, 1927, in Fall River, at her home. At the time of her death, she was worth over $250,000. She also owned a house on the corner of Belmont Street, several office buildings, shares in several utilities, 2 cars, and a large amount of jewelry. Funeral details were not published, and few attended. Emma died 9 days later at a nursing home in Newmarket, New Hampshire. She was 76. Both long-time spinsters, Lizzie and Emma, were buried side by side in the family plot at Oak Grove Cemetery in Fall River.